Good morning. This is the BLAINESWORLD webcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and get more information and find out about previous shows at our website, which is behind me, blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and I'm here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Corbett, a mental health therapist. And thanks for joining me today. You can wait to all your fans and friends who are watching this. Great.
Hi, excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Blaine.
I'm certainly excited to have you. Elizabeth Corbett is a trauma informed therapist who works with people who have been feeling overwhelmed and stuck for a long time. They are now ready to explore a more sustainable way of being in the world. She entered the field of clinical mental health counseling after working for 2 decades in the medical world as a nurse. So you started what, at the age of 7? You were like the youngest nurse?
You're kind, you're kind.
Fine,
Yes, it seems a long time ago, but boy, blink of an eye also.
isn't it? For sure. Her office is in the Montford neighborhood here in Asheville, and she also works as a certified therapist at Heart for Sense in Marshall, providing equine-assisted psychotherapy for veterans, first responders, and other survivors of trauma. So the question I always ask the first time I meet somebody, Elizabeth, is as a child, you grew up where?
I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. And when you grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, did you always know you wanted to be a therapist?
Absolutely not. I was thinking about my journey earlier this week, and I could not have predicted that. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. I've been a horse person my whole life, but therapy was not on my radar. No.
So you became first a nurse, is that correct?
Well, first I got a degree in writing and I wanted to be a professional writer. So that was my first degree at University of Georgia. And after about 5 years of, boy, eating a lot of ramen noodles, I went back to school in Emory to become a nurse. And I did that for 20 years.
And what kind of nurse were you?
I was critical care in a neonatal ICU for 10 years. And then I worked in community health, running school health programs in public and private school districts.
And so then at some point in time, you decided you wanted to become a therapist?
Yeah, exactly. It was directly informed by the work I did as a nurse. I worked with kids and their parents who had significant medical issues, some of them terminal diagnoses, some of them really devastating medical events that had happened that were going to be a part of their experience the rest of their lives. And I saw that they got great care for their physical needs, and there was really no support for the medical emotional piece of that, the mental health piece of going through medical trauma. And so, yeah, I went back to grad school because I directly wanted to work with folks who were impacted by traumatic events and didn't really know how to move forward from it and didn't have the support to even figure it out.
So you were doing this then in addition to being a nurse in your spare time?
Yeah, I was being a nurse and then I went to school at night school. So I would go to class, I would leave work at 5, I would go to class at 6, I would be in class for 3 to 4 hours, depending on the night, and come home and do it all again. But I don't regret it. It was a way to keep working, support my family, and also um, enter into this field, which I love being a part of. So it was hard work, but worth it.
You probably also didn't get much sleep during those years.
No, but I also had 3 kids, so sleep, kind of elusive anyway.
So that took you how many years?
So that was a 2-year program, a little over 2 years once I did my full-time year internship. And then I graduated in 2020 in the early spring. And then I moved to Western North Carolina almost immediately and launched my own private practice.
Now that was some period of time you entered. So shortly thereafter, we also hit that was COVID time, right? Or shortly thereafter.
Absolutely. It was COVID time. Yep.
So that's a gutsy move on your part. I mean, you both you finished school and then you moved at the same time to this area.
I sure did. Yep. I left Atlanta where I had lived my whole life basically and moved to Western North Carolina. Didn't know anyone other than the folks at Horse Sense of the Carolinas, where I had done all my equine therapy trainings over the years.
So what got you to this area?
Yeah, good question. I didn't think I'd land here. I thought I'd land somewhere in North Georgia. Um, because of licensing, really, being a primary breadwinner, I needed to be licensed to be able to do the work I was going to do as a nurse or a healthcare provider, mental health care provider. But I fell in love with Asheville. I fell in love with it. And so I just trusted that it would work out, and I just jumped in with all I had and didn't look back.
Yeah, that was really a gutsy move. I mean, in thinking about it, that not only you're a new area, but you entered into your own practice. You started your own practice right away.
Started my own practice right away. Yeah.
Wow. So how was that?
Um, it was a big learning curve for sure. I never imagined myself being a business owner, but I also knew exactly the kind of work I wanted to do. And I think being older allowed me to be a little more intentional about how I found work. And so I just hunkered down and had a lot of really generous mentors to help guide me through the process. And I had supervisors who supported my growth as a clinician. So I don't regret it, but for sure it was a learning experience with a lot of opportunity for looking at mistakes and realizing I could do things a little different next time.
And what's interesting about what you're talking about is the fact that when you go to school, become a nurse or a therapist, you learn lots of technical skills, I guess, but nobody
Right.
ever teaches you how to start a business, you know?
Ever,
And
ever.
so what happened? So in 2020, you just put a shingle out and started asking people to come see you?
Yeah, it didn't work exactly like that. So my internship, which was a year long full-time work, was at a private practice. So it was a family therapy practice that worked with a lot of the population that I really wanted to work with. So I did get to have a year of mentoring. The person that owns that practice is still a mentor that I reach out to often. So I had a year of the mentoring from the business side. How do you do this in an ethical way that aligns with your values? And I also got the clinical work mentoring piece. So
By
I
the way,
was really lucky there.
sounds it. By the way, since you mentioned, can you give a shout out to that person if you feel comfortable?
Yes, yes. So the place is in Atlanta. So it's a Perspective Center for Holistic Therapy. It's a group practice of collaborative clinicians who do mental health work as well as speech language work. And so they serve members of families from 2 to 102. Yeah.
And what's so nice about what you're describing is that sometimes when somebody breaks off or doesn't practice, they get resentment. But it sounds like these people were giving you the blessing to go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. They really, that was definitely part of their model. That's why I chose them. Again, being older, I knew what I wanted to do and what I wanted to learn through my internship. So I was real intentional in the places I look for opportunities. And we just, it was a good fit for both of us. Yeah, they supported growth and just taking it out and running with it.
Very
Um,
nice. So talk about coming to Asheville. So had you been familiar with Asheville before?
I had been to Asheville twice in my life, so I wasn't familiar with it. I knew I was drawn to the mountains. I knew I had a big hiking community back in Atlanta. And so I knew I wanted to live in the mountains. I knew I wanted to live in a less urban area. And other than that, I just liked what I saw here. I liked the people I met here. I loved the landscape. It just felt like a place I could land and stay for a while.
So talk about the fact then you into the area. How did you start getting people to come see you, or how did you start building clientele?
Yeah, boy. That was a hard time. I'm not going to lie. The pandemic, right? Because a lot of it was virtual, and a lot of the work I do as a therapist is experiential. And what I mean by that is it's not sitting in a room just talking. It's doing equine therapy where you're actively engaging in the environment with a horse or a herd of horses. I also do narrative therapy, so that is writing your story and the growth and healing that can come from that, and in person is a different experience than doing it virtually. And then I also do a lot of outdoor based therapy just because we know when we're outdoors, our our bodies kind of settle down and we're a little bit calmer often if we can be out in nature. So it was really hard to find clients because there was a significant safety issue of being in each other's space. I did a lot of telehealth, people who knew me from when I was an intern that wanted to follow me, and I was licensed in Georgia and North Carolina, so I was able to see them. I worked a lot with children, and I actually ended up letting that go, and that was a point of grief for me, but it was really hard to work online with young children. It didn't serve them well, and it wasn't a good fit for me. So I would say word of mouth. Um, I joined the therapist community in Asheville, which is incredibly supportive. Huge shout out to that community because it's very generous. So I just made some local connections within that community. And then I just started telling people about what I was doing. And word of mouth, I think, is what has allowed me to do the work in the way I'm doing it now.
Now, do you still do telehealth?
I do some telehealth, probably about 30% is telehealth with clients in Georgia and North Carolina. About 50% is outdoors, either at the farm or working in green spaces. And then I've got some folks who come to my office in Montford.
Because what's really cool, what you're saying, is that it's changed since when I was a kid. When they first mentioned the idea of being able to do it, telehealth or even video, it was unheard of. But
Yeah,
it really makes sense, for a lot of people,
it sure
just
does.
just for the convenience factor. They don't have to come in to see you. But you mentioned now, let's talk a little bit about this work. So a large part of your work is with the with horses, and
Mhm.
first time I ever heard that, I said, "Whoa, what's this all about?" But I'll let you do the honors. So what's it like working with horses?
Yeah. Um, there's so much to say about that. So I will say I had just the lived experience of being introduced to horses when I was a little girl, and I just was horse crazy. So I knew what it was like for me to grow up in some tough situations where I grew up. There were some it was a tough upbringing in some ways, and I had access to horses, and I knew that having access to being outdoors, getting to connect with these creatures who are so attuned and so interested in connecting with humans, I knew what that did for me. So that informed my interests professionally. And then what I learned is I started doing the training required to become a mental health therapist working with horses. What I learned is all the different layers and levels that a person can be impacted by that work. There's the ways that a horse can really be a mirror. So when you walk into a space where a horse is, if you're feeling terrified, they're going to move away from you because they are prey animals and we're predators. So if we come in with energy that is not calming or relaxing or confidence building, they're prey animals, so they're going to get really far away from that. So they're a great way to work with noticing your own internal experience and ways you can change, maybe thoughts you're having about your competence or your value. They can help you learn to regulate, you know, your heart rate and your breathing and how calm you feel inside because they give instant feedback in a really non-judgmental way. And then the last thing, and I could talk for, I don't know, 5 hours about this, but I won't. The last thing is that when you are a group and you're working with horses, the roles that you tend to fill in groups. Let's say you're always the fixer, or let's say you're always the person that points out what's not working. The role that you fill in groups naturally becomes really evident when horses become part of the picture. And again, it's just a way to kind of notice, oh, I do this thing and it's not serving me well. And then you can kind of play around with showing up differently and again get that instant feedback. So in a nutshell, I would say horses help us learn what it's like to be regulated and calm, which allows us to figure out different choices we have available to us when we're making decisions because we can take that pause and respond rather than react. And horses teach us how to respond rather than just react to the stimuli.
Now, as a child, did you have a horse?
I did.
Did you really? Wow,
Yeah.
that's very
Yeah.
cool.
And a funny story about my first horse. So I got my first horse when I was 8. There are 4 kids in our family. I'm the only girl. I was horse crazy, like I said, and my first horse, it just gives you a little bit of a sense of my family. My first horse was a male horse who had been gelded, so he had gone from being a stallion to being gelded and not being able to sire. He was gelded late in life, so he lived a life as a stallion, and his name was Boss. So my first horse as a 7, 8-year-old was with a wild, almost stallion whose name was Boss. So he taught me a lot. He taught me a lot about being the boss.
So how long was he around?
Yeah, so I had him for about 3 years. And then in high school, I had another horse that I had all through high school and college. His name was Flame. And then I had a horse late college that I ended up when I moved away after college and lived in Maryland for a little while. I had that horse until I moved away, and my trainer took him when I moved. So uh, all very different experiences. And then I had a horse. I got a horse in my 40s that I had for about 15 years. So
You have a
different.
horse? You have a horse now?
I don't. I recently lost my horse, who is my therapy partner.
Oh,
She was old. She had a wonderful life, and she died last May, naturally and gently during a nap in the pasture. So
oh,
right now, I don't have a horse, but I do get to play with horses every week, which I'm grateful for.
but as you're talking, I'm thinking that's very sweet how she died, how she passed. But
Yeah.
I would imagine too, as a therapist or even as a child growing up, that was a great way to learn how to deal with trauma in terms of having horses pass, or have horses die. I imagine that's very, very tough, but that's part of life, I guess, or that's part of growing to experience that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that you're so right. It's an opportunity to sit with some really painful, difficult feelings and to figure out what to do with them, right? To figure out how to honor and hold all the really happy memories and also how to get a little distance from the grief over time so that you don't get stuck in that place.
Now, explain if with the work you do. So you mentioned you work, is this work typically done in groups then? Is that how it's done?
Yeah, so right now, primarily what I do is I do a lot of group work. I work with a lot of veteran groups at Horse Sense of the Carolinas. I work with a lot of substance abuse groups. So there's a lot of group work where really the goal is to notice how you show up, to notice if it's working for you, and if it's not, to practice and get support around trying out different ways of being. And I also do individual work. I don't do the traditional hourly sessions. What I do is the owner of Horse Sense, Shannon Knapp, she and I have created a program where we do extended sessions that tend to be 3 to 4 hours, and we'll do several of those for several weeks at a time. It's called an intensive therapy program. And she and I developed this program because I do them in my other experiences as a therapist. I do this in the office and out in green spaces. And what I know is that when you can have more time to do this work, you can dive deep and you can kind of stay there and really get traction, which allows you to often it allows you to make a lot more progress in a much more concentrated amount of time. So, so that's how I work at Horse Sense.
So is the work you do, I intend at Horse Sense with the horses, but sometimes is it in your office or sometimes is it outside of with not with the horses around?
Yes, absolutely. I do the same work, this extended sessions, kind of deep dive, and it's often with people who want to work on something specific. I mentioned I work with veterans a lot. I work with a lot of first responders. I work with a lot of police officers. And so often people come to me because they had something specific happen. Maybe they saw uh, a partner get shot if they're a police officer. Maybe they were working with hurricane, and they were getting to those places where people had really struggled and suffered and some had died. So they have a specific thing that has been really hard for them to move past. So they'll come to me and do a therapy intensive, and we'll do often EMDR, which is, if you're familiar with it, people call it that weird eye movement therapy where you move your eyes left to right. And what we know is it allows us to work with traumatic memories and really have them get integrated in a different way in our brain so that it's easier for us to move forward without having that heavy impact. So they'll come to me because they've had an experience, they feel stuck, and they want to do EMDR or other trauma-focused therapies so that they can get past it.
Now, I'm familiar with groups in psychology work, but how is it different, I guess, or is it similar when you're working with horses instead of the like on group work, very exciting, you're working one with a group, small group, but how does it come into play when the horses are involved?
Yeah, well, when I think about that question, and it's a fun question to think about, you think about who you are as a person, and then think about who you are as a person in a group.
Right.
Are you exactly the same? Are you a little different, right? Are you different when it's one-on-one versus you being in a group of 20? So the group experience allows you to really notice how you are out in the world. And when the horses are a part of that, they're going to respond to your own energy, for lack of a better word, what you put out there. They're going to kind of identify you. Are you a safe person? Are you someone that I want to be really far away from? Do you feel kind of chaotic and disorganized? Are you mad? Are you really quiet and you don't want to engage? Are you afraid? So when the horses are part of group work, they tend to respond to the group dynamic, which can lead to a lot of really interesting conversation about why is this dynamic the way it is? And if it's not a healthy one, say we're doing a team building experience for folks who work together and they realize, ooh, how we work as a team is not good because every time we approach the horses, they all run away or they all try to kick up their heels. So then it's some opportunity for reflection as a group about how do we want to be, how do we want to work together, and what can we do differently. And same with individuals, the horses give feedback about what you're bringing into the space, um, and give you the opportunity to, if that doesn't sit well with you, then to try some different ways of showing up.
When you're with the horses, explain, if you would please, how big are the groups? In other words, are there multiple horses, are there multiple people, and small, large, what's the size of them?
Yeah, yeah. It can look different depending on what we're working on, but I would say, generally speaking, across the board, groups can be up to, let's say, 12. But often if we have a large group, then we're going to divide them and we'll have half the people in with the horses and half the people observing, and then we'll switch. So it's not often that we'll have, more than 8 people in the space with the horses. And we do work with whole herds. So we have multiple herds at the farm. The biggest one is a herd of 8. And we will often work with that herd. And then it might be that we select several horses from the herd to do a little bit more of a deeper dive. And the clients are making those choices. So we let the clients meet the herd. And the really cool thing about equine therapy is that you're going to be drawn to the horse that has something to teach you. So what we've learned is we just stay back here. We know it's going to unfold just like it should. And it truly works out that way. People are drawn to the horses that are going to provide the challenge they need to kind of get over their stuck point.
So if there's a group of 8 veterans or 8 different folks, how many
Yeah.
horses will be in that same, working with them at the same time?
Yeah. So I would say potentially it could be up to 8. Um, And it depends on the goals, right? If we want to have individual work where we want to have one person working with one horse, then we might utilize the entire herd so that each person can work on building that relationship and learning about connection and communication with a creature that doesn't speak our language, right? So how do you translate what they might want or how they might feel, and how do you communicate the same to them if they don't speak your language? So if we want to have that sort of experience where you really pay attention to the information you're getting and giving off, then it would be one-on-one. So we'd have 8 horses and 8 people. If we want to do some teamwork, right? Like how is it for you when you work with your spouse versus when you're trying to get everything done by yourself? You do that great, but with your spouse, you guys end up fighting all the time and end up in this power struggle. Then we might just have the two of you work with one horse, or maybe the two of you work with two horses, right? Just so you can experience that dynamic. So there's no right or wrong answer. It depends on the goals for the group and the individuals in the group.
But when you're doing this, I assume you have more than one person doing this with you. It's not just you alone.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question because that's such an important piece of the model. What the model that we follow at Horse Sense and the one that I was trained in is that you have a mental health therapist who's licensed and gone through all the training, the master's or PhD level training. And then you have an equine specialist, and that's the horse expert. So they help to maintain safety, and they also help with the interpretation of what the horse might be thinking or feeling. So they're kind of the advocate for the horse as well as the interpreter. And then we consider our horses also part of our treatment team. And the reason I mention that is that a big difference in equine therapy versus kind of traditional horsemanship is that we don't look at the horse as a tool, as a thing to be used. They're sentient beings that contribute in a very rich way to the process. And so their consent and their engagement is considered, their welfare is considered every step of the way in the same way ours is and our clients' welfare is considered. So it's really, there's a lot of emphasis on consent and communication within the whole team, which is a real departure from traditional horsemanship, where it's about I'm dominating this animal to get them to do what I want them to do.
But even in terms of traditional therapy, it's vastly different because again, it's a team effort, which is very exciting. It's a team effort as
Yes,
opposed to just you, the one person, the therapist. I
yes.
imagine too, what must be kind of interesting for you when people start this. You have some people who are afraid of horses initially,
Oh, absolutely. Many of them. Uh-huh.
and do they eventually get over it?
Sometimes. And sometimes not. That alone can be something really interesting to work on, to look at, because they are really big creatures. And we have some folks who will go into the arena and they'll just walk up to the biggest horse and have no sense of, am I safe or am I not? And then some people might feel so unsafe even walking onto the farm property that them just getting within eyesight of a horse is a huge accomplishment. So yeah, often people will say, I'm scared of them. I've never been around them. I don't know what to do. And that's okay. They don't have to have any experience or any courage other than the courage to step into a situation that's a little uncomfortable and new to them and to just be open to trying to do something new.
If you would, Elizabeth, describe kind of a typical, not a typical one, the success story. In other words, take it from where you worked with somebody who had no idea what they were getting into, and all of a sudden, and how long, by the way, working them, how long also does it take?
Yeah. Um, Really hard to put a timeline. It takes as long as it takes, depending on what they're working on and what's going on in their life outside of therapy, right? Because sometimes situations in our life outside of the therapy world make it harder or make it easier to progress, depending on the social support you have and your physical health and um, how available you're able to be to do this deep work. So it's hard to say how long it takes. Like I mentioned, Shannon and I have created these therapy intensives, and they tend to be 12 hours of therapy in 1 month. So it's real concentrated. And often people walk away, well, always people walk away with some growth. And often people walk away having reached all of their goals. So, so I'll speak from that perspective because I don't do the hourly work, which can sometimes last longer because it's an ongoing process. Um, if people are ready to dive in, if people have set it up so they can be there and they're able to commit to being there for the full 3 hours each week, then I would say almost always they're able to make progress. And if they don't meet their goals, then they're able to see, okay, this is something that I still want to work on, and I have a plan of how I can work on this. We always want them to be thinking about, how can I take what's happening here in the arena? How can I take it out into my life outside of the farm, right? Because that's where the real change happens, what you do with the experiences you've had at the farm. Um, so I think it's really dependent on each person, each goal, but having a treatment team versus an individual, I think really facilitates the growth happening more quickly and more effectively.
But I would imagine also even for the therapist, it's kind of helpful. So it's not just you doing all the 100% of the work. You have
Yeah.
other people to help you and discuss it, whatnot. Just give me a typical example. If somebody comes in or somebody fairly recently, what kind of problems, trauma are they dealing with? Or can you give a specific example without, of course, keeping confidentiality or names? But
Mhm.
give me an example of somebody who would come into you for help.
Yeah. I have, you mentioned a success story, and I think that a success story that I'll draw from several people,
Sure.
maintaining the confidentiality, but similar themes. Often people want to work on relationships. They might be in a long-term relationship. They might have a relationship with a teenager, people they care deeply about, but they're really struggling with having a healthy relationship. There can be a lot of arguing or maybe just some disengagement, shutting down. So they want to work on relationships. So a success story that I see time and time again is they show up and they're like, I want to, well, often it's, I want to fix, right? I want to fix my husband so that he doesn't do these things, and they
It's,
realize,
it's, it's always the other person,
oh,
right?
absolutely, right? It's always the other guy's fault. And then you get that realization of, oh, wow, I've got some things happening here with me that might be contributing to this dynamic we have. Maybe it's not just about the other person. Um, so almost always they have that kind of light bulb moment because of how the horses are responding to them, right? I'm good. I'm communicative. I say how I feel. People love me. And then they walk into the arena and the horses are all like, whoa, you're coming in hot. Um, so there's that period of realizing I'm contributing. And then there's that period of realizing I'm contributing in this way because these are patterns I have in my life. And the reason I have these patterns is because they served me really well, when I was in college or when I was a teenager or when I was a little kid. And they realized these patterns that worked really well for me when I was younger, they're not working well for me now. And so then they start to figure out, well, what would I like to be different? And they're focusing that attention on what they can do differently. So they've shifted away from this person needs to be fixed, which is never satisfying, right? Because people never agree, right? If they would just do what we say they need to do, it'd be so much easier. But you can't try to fix other people. And so when that attention gets turned inward, then all of a sudden they realize they've got a lot more agency in changing things within themselves. So then they start to make some changes and then they get to see the horses responding differently. And I'm getting chill bumps, Blaine, as I think about it because it's so powerful to see it unfold in the arena. Um, and so they walk away knowing I can make changes. I can see that it's impactful. And then I can take these changes out into my relationships with humans to have a more connected, compassionate relationship with this person I care about.
What's knocking my socks off about what you're talking about is the fact, too, that this can be done in a relatively short period of time. You're saying that most of this takes place in just a month?
Yeah, we do. When we do the
Oh,
intensive sessions, we'll do a 3 hour session and we'll do it week after week for 3 or 4 weeks. And then when we touch base, we have what we call a debrief as part of our intensive program. So we touch base 2 to 4 weeks after our last session. And that's where we say, so what's happening? What are you noticing? Have there been any changes internally or externally? And that's where people really have had time to think about the impact. And yes, we have seen a lot of transformative shifts happen. And I think it's the model. It's the model of having extended sessions where you can really dive into the work and you can stay there rather than having this kind of artificial, well, we're at time, so we got to close up. See you next week.
well, it's also what's exciting to me to listen to this is the fact that you also have more than one person involved. So you have the group itself, then you have you and another person. And so
Yeah,
it's not just a one-on-one type thing. You have other people involved in the process. Where
that's
does weather come into play?
yeah. Yeah.
Weather, how does that affect things?
Yeah, I think that you've got the collective wisdom of the group, and you've also got different lenses. You know, I'm looking through one lens, the equine specialist is looking through another lens. Each horse is they're their own person, their own being. So they all have their own lenses. So that person, the client, is getting a lot more feedback from more people. So it's just more information for them to consider. So yeah, I love the collaborative piece of doing that work. And I also, in the writing classes that I teach, and those are with veterans that I hope I'll get a minute to touch on today. Again, that's collaborative. I have a co-facilitator, and it just adds to the wealth of the experience, the richness of the experience.
And then the two questions, but the one I asked before though, how does weather come into play on this? In other words, are you outside on this, or is
Yeah.
it, if it's hurricane, how does that affect things?
Yeah, if it's hurricane, we're going to all hunker down. But weather in general, a horse sense of the Carolinas, it's a 110-acre farm,
Okay.
and they have multiple places that we can be, including two covered arenas. So we have one indoor arena, which is a fully enclosed kind of barn-like space. And then we have an outdoor arena that has half walls, but it has a metal roof. So we can be out of the elements. If it's raining or snowing, you know, we can pretty much be outside as long as everybody has their layers on, unless there's lightning. If there's lightning, then generally we'll call it. But we're able to work outside because we have covered spaces.
And same thing too, even with the hurricane, you were able to, not during the hurricane, but shortly thereafter, you were back up and running.
Yeah, they were lucky. They did not sustain a lot of damage on their farm. So I think it depends on where equine therapy farms are located. But once the hurricane was over, because we don't use Wi-Fi, you know, we're not using anything
Right.
technology. And so if we can get there, then we can do the work. So that's a really nice piece post-hurricane of working outdoors, is that if we can get there now, and so we can continue with our work.
And you mentioned one thing I find interesting, so I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. But you also, there's also a writing component to this, and what's that?
Yes, so this is something that is very dear to my heart. I mentioned my first degree was in writing, and that's what I wanted to do. And I've continued to write throughout my life. I find it to be an incredible way to tap into my creativity and kind of dreaming about things I want for myself. And it's also been a great way to heal from difficulties that I've encountered. And there's a local nonprofit in Western North Carolina called Brothers and Sisters Like These. And it originally was started at the VA, and it's a creative writing group that is not about the craft of writing. It's more about the value of telling your story and having your story be witnessed by others. And so I'm a writer in residence at Brothers and Sisters Like These. Um, Elizabeth Haney, who is also a local therapist and a phenomenal writer, she has been a mentor for me, and she is also a writer in residence there. And what we do is free of charge for veterans. We hold writing groups where we meet for an hour and a half every week for 8 weeks, and we provide prompts, and they work on the prompts during the week, and then they come in and they read their stories, and we respond. We respond with what we call echoes, which is rather than saying that scene where you talked about the helicopter in your first jump, we will actually verbatim echo back to them what landed with us, right? Smoke was everywhere. And when the smoke cleared, this is what I saw, right? We give them the actual words they used in their story that were impactful for us. And so it's a writing group where people are writing weekly. We write in class, but really the goal is to use the fine arts and creative writing for people to access some healing um, from their combat experiences or their experiences of being in the military, to help them work through things that have been very difficult and very painful to hold inside. Many people have never told their story before they join this group.
Now, are some of these participants that gone through the first part, like with you with the horses, and they graduate to this, or are they doing this at the same time?
No, this is actually very separate. So in my private practice, I work with horse sense and I provide equine therapy. So this is another arm of my private practice, so to speak, where I work as a writer with my therapist hat kind of over here, but I'm wearing my writer hat. So they are not affiliated with the equine therapy unless they're curious about it. So it's veteran population, um, but it's separate from the equine therapy piece.
So if folks want to get more information about the equine therapy or about the solar lighting project you
Yeah.
mentioned, what's the best bet?
Yeah. So the equine therapy, I recommend looking up the website of Horse Sense, SENSE of the Carolinas. They have a nonprofit arm which funds a significant amount of therapy work for veterans and people who have been victims of crime. So the nonprofit is called Heart of Horse Sense. So you could also look for that. So going to their website is going to give you all the information you might need as well as contact info. And then for the writing nonprofit, we're actually having a public reading tonight in Weaverville at the community center. So if any of your listeners are like, oh, I want to do something fun tonight, I invite them to go to that. It's at 7 p.m. where we'll have people reading, and we're also going to have some dance pieces where people have taken the story of a veteran and choreographed it. And also, we're going to have some original songs in there. So it's going to be a really cool event. But if you can't be there tonight, in like 5 hours, then if you go on the website, it's called Brothers and Sisters Like These. And you can also look up the North Carolina Writers Alliance. They're partnered, and that will also have contact info as well as podcasts where you can listen to people telling their stories. And there are also 2 books that have been published that you can purchase on the website. We have a 3rd book coming out in the next few months.
And that website again is what?
Brothers and Sisters Like These.
Anyway, I'd like to thank you, Elizabeth, Corbett, for
Yeah,
being my guest on this edition of the Blaine's World webcast.
yeah.
Good stuff. It's really very exciting. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to spend time with you today.
Likewise, I also like to thank my producer, Cappy Cassetti, and someday, somewhere, hopefully we'll even get to meet in person.
Yes, I would love that.
That'd be great. Thanks again.